The FBI keeps a classified file on certain Appalachian bloodlines, families so dangerous they're monitored like terrorist organizations. Deep in the mountains of Appalachia, land wasn't just property, it was bloodline. For generations, families passed down the same rocky ridges, the same creek bottoms, the same hidden hollers where their great-grandfathers first cleared trees and built cabins. These weren't people who moved around much. The Hatfields controlled one side of the Tug Fork River, the McCoys owned the other. But here's the thing about mountain families, they didn't just own land, they asterisk the land. Every boundary marker told a story. Every family cemetery held the bones of people who'd rather die than sell out. When trouble came knocking, you didn't call the sheriff, you called your cousins, and in Appalachia, everybody had a lot of cousins. These weren't nuclear families like you'd find in the suburbs. We're talking about sprawling networks of brothers, uncles, second cousins, and in-laws who all lived within shouting distance of each other. Makes sense, right? When your nearest neighbor might be 5 miles away, family becomes everything. The McCoys had been feuding with the Hatfields since the Civil War, but that was just the most famous example. Mountain families settled disputes the old-fashioned way, with fists, knives, and eventually guns. Why? Because the nearest courthouse might be a 2-day ride through dangerous terrain, and the local judge probably owed favors to one family or another anyway. Local power didn't come from badges or official titles, it came from having the biggest family tree and the meanest reputation. A man named Devil Anse Hatfield never got elected to anything, but he controlled more territory than most mayors. He had 13 children and dozens of nephews who'd ride with him whenever he called. That's political power, mountain style. Then there's the matter of outside authority. Mountain families had been ignoring government orders since before there was a government to ignore. They'd fled from kings in Scotland, sheriffs in Virginia, and tax collectors everywhere else. When federal agents showed up in the hollers, they often found families who'd been successfully avoiding outside interference for decades. These kinship networks created their own justice system. Steal a man's cow, and you'd answer to his entire clan. Insult someone's daughter, and you might wake up to find 20 armed relatives on your front porch. The weird part is, it actually worked pretty well if you were part of the system. But what happened when the outside world finally caught up with these mountain kingdoms? Well, that's where things get interesting. Some families adapted and found ways to work within the new system. Others doubled down on the old ways, turning family loyalty into something that looked a lot like organized resistance to anyone watching from Washington. The federal government was definitely watching and taking notes. Because when traditional mountain justice started clashing with modern law enforcement, the results were about to get very bloody, very public, and very dangerous for everyone involved. The Hatfield-McCoy feud wasn't just some backwoods squabble that got out of hand. This thing turned into a full-blown war that lasted over 20 years and left dozens of people dead. What started as a dispute over a stolen pig, yes, really, a pig, escalated into midnight raids, executions, and eventually required federal intervention to stop the bloodshed. Devil Anse Hatfield and Randolph McCoy became the faces of mountain justice gone wrong. Their families lived on opposite sides of the Tug Fork River, with Hatfields in West Virginia and McCoys in Kentucky. But geography couldn't contain their hatred. The feud exploded after the Civil War, when political differences mixed with personal grudges and property disputes. Soon both clans were hunting each other like wild animals. The violence was brutal and calculated. On New Year's night 1888, a group of Hatfields surrounded the McCoy cabin and set it on fire. When family members tried to escape the flames, they were shot down. Elifair McCoy, just a teenager, was killed in cold blood. Her mother Sarah watched helplessly as her children were murdered. Makes your family arguments seem pretty tame, right? Then there were the mine wars of the 1920s, where family loyalties turned even deadlier. In West Virginia's coalfields, entire clans picked sides between mining companies and union organizers. The Baldwin Felts Detective Agency brought in armed guards who didn't hesitate to shoot first and ask questions later. Local families responded with guerrilla warfare tactics they'd learned from generations of feuding. Property disputes in mountain hollows became death sentences. Families would fight over boundary lines, mineral rights, or water access with the same intensity others might argue over parking spaces. But these weren't shouting matches. They were shootouts that could wipe out entire bloodlines. The mountains echoed with gunfire as neighbors settled scores that sometimes dated back decades. The weird part is how these feuds followed unwritten rules. You didn't kill women and children unless they were directly involved. You gave fair warning before an attack. You respected certain neutral territories like churches and schools. Even in the middle of deadly chaos, mountain families maintained their own twisted sense of honor. Blair Mountain in 1921 showed just how far things could escalate. Thousands of armed miners, many from feuding families, marched against company forces and federal troops. It became the largest armed uprising in American history since the Civil War. Planes dropped bombs on American citizens for the first time on domestic soil. The violence was so intense that martial law had to be declared across entire counties. These mountain wars created a problem that went far beyond local politics. Every newspaper in America was printing stories about wild hillbillies who settled disputes with dynamite and rifles. The stereotypes were forming fast, and they weren't flattering. What most people didn't understand was that this violence came from somewhere deeper than simple hot tempers. These families were defending a way of life that outside forces were trying to destroy. But their methods were about to put them on the wrong side of federal attention in ways they never expected. The feuds were messy, but they were just family business. What happened next changed everything. The federal government decided it was time to start taking notes. By the 1930s, Washington had filing cabinets full of names. Appalachian families who'd caused trouble found themselves on official lists. The Department of Justice kept track of who fought back against evictions. The Department of Labor noted which families organized strikes. Even local sheriffs sent reports up the chain about problem clans. Makes sense, right? Well, here's where it gets weird. Families didn't just end up on watch lists for violence, they got flagged for defending their own land. When the government seized property for national parks, some families refused to leave quietly. Those names went straight into federal files. Dam projects forced entire communities to relocate. The families who complained loudest tracked and monitored. Take the creation of Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Hundreds of families lost their homes through eminent domain. Most packed up and left without a fuss, but the ones who hired lawyers or organized protests found themselves labeled as resistant elements. Their children couldn't get government jobs decades later because dad had fought to keep the family farm. Then there's the martial law situation. Coal strikes in the 1920s and 1930s got so intense that governors called in federal troops. Entire counties went under military control. Logan County, West Virginia saw soldiers patrolling the streets for months. During these periods, anyone who so much as looked at a soldier wrong ended up in a federal report. The Department of Labor created something called depressed area classifications. Sounds boring, but it wasn't just about economics. They factored in social unrest and violent tendencies when deciding which regions needed special attention. Translation: areas with too much family feuding got marked as problem zones. Local law enforcement became federal informants without realizing it. Sheriff departments filed routine reports about domestic disputes, property disagreements, and public disturbances. Those reports traveled to Washington, where bureaucrats built detailed profiles of mountain families. Uncle Joe's bar fight in 1932 might still be in a file somewhere. The really wild part, families didn't know they were being watched. There was no notification system, no, hey, you're on our list. Letters, people just noticed that government jobs became harder to get. Military service applications faced extra scrutiny. Bank loans got rejected more often. Some families discovered their status by accident. A son would apply to work for the Postal Service and get turned down for security reasons. Or a daughter couldn't get hired as a school teacher because of family associations. The government never explained what those associations were. Federal agencies shared information freely. The FBI talked to the Department of Agriculture. Labor Department files crossed desks at the Interior Department. One family's run-in with park rangers could affect their ability to get farm subsidies years later. But the government wasn't just watching and taking notes, they were actively seizing millions of acres of Appalachian land, and some families weren't about to go quietly into that good night. By the 1970s, something shocking became crystal clear. The Appalachian Land Ownership Survey dropped a bombshell that left mountain families stunned. 70% of mineral rights were owned by corporations, not the people living on the land. Think about that for a second. Families who called these mountains home for generations suddenly discovered they owned the surface, but not what lay beneath their feet. Corporate giants like Peabody Energy and Consolidation Coal weren't just buying land anymore, they were systematically gobbling up entire counties. When families refused to sell, things got ugly fast. Legal teams descended on small communities like armies of lawyers in expensive suits, armed with eminent domain papers and court orders that might as well have been written in ancient Greek for all the sense they made to local folks. But here's where it gets interesting. These weren't the same mountain families from 50 years earlier who might have settled disputes with shotguns and moonshine. Well, not entirely anyway. They'd learned to fight back using the system's own weapons, lawsuits, appeals, and media attention. The Boone family in West Virginia tied up coal companies in court for 6 years over mineral rights disputes. 6 years. That's longer than most corporate executives stay in their jobs. Then there's the Price family saga in eastern Kentucky. When Arch Coal showed up with bulldozers to strip mine their ancestral burial ground, 3 generations of Prices chained themselves to century-old oak trees. Grandma Price, all 82 years of her, became a local legend when she told reporters, "They can arrest me, but they can't arrest my roots." Federal agencies started keeping detailed files on families who fought back too hard. Makes sense, right? If you're costing billion-dollar companies money, someone's taking notes. The FBI's Appalachian files from this era read like a who's who of stubborn mountain families who refused to roll over for corporate interests. Legal battles stretched on for years, sometimes decades. Families mortgaged everything they owned just to pay lawyers who spoke the same fancy language as the corporate legal teams. The Adkins clan in Virginia spent their life savings fighting a pipeline that would cut through their farm. They lost the case but won something else. Respect from neighbors who saw them stand up to giants. And the weird part is, after these massive land seizures destroyed communities and displaced thousands, some family groups did turn to more creative forms of protest. Mysterious equipment breakdowns, survey stakes that kept disappearing overnight, heavy machinery that somehow developed sugar and gas tanks. Most families stuck to civil disobedience, though. They'd learned that violent resistance just gave corporations and government agencies exactly the excuse they needed to crack down harder. What these corporate land grabs really did was unite mountain families in ways the old feuds never could. When your enemy isn't the clan next valley over, but a faceless corporation from New York, suddenly your neighbors start looking like allies instead of rivals. But peaceful protest and legal battles were just the beginning of what these families were willing to do. The government watch lists and corporate land grabs didn't just make Appalachian families angry, they made them dangerous. By the 1920s, thousands of mountain families had enough of being pushed around. Coal companies owned their land, federal agents tracked their movements, and outside forces controlled their lives. What happened next wasn't pretty, but it was predictable. When people have nothing left to lose, they fight back. Blair Mountain became the proving ground. In 1921, over 10,000 armed miners marched across West Virginia's rugged terrain, facing off against company guards and federal troops. This wasn't some small-town scuffle between neighbors. We're talking about the largest armed uprising on American soil since the Civil War. Families who'd been branded as troublemakers by the feds suddenly found themselves leading a full-scale rebellion. The miners wore red bandanas around their necks. That's where the term redneck actually comes from, though most people don't know that. These weren't random acts of violence either. Mountain families organized like military units, using their knowledge of local terrain to outmaneuver professional soldiers. Makes sense, right? They'd been hunting these hills their entire lives. Then there's the pipeline protests that followed decades later. When energy companies tried to run natural gas lines through family properties, the resistance looked different but felt the same. Tree sitting became an art form. Elderly grandmothers chained themselves to bulldozers while their grandsons set up elaborate barricades using fallen logs and creek stones. Federal marshals showed up expecting to deal with a few angry locals and instead found entire communities ready for war. But here's where it gets interesting. Most families didn't actually turn to violence, despite what the headlines suggested. Civil disobedience was their weapon of choice. They'd block roads during hunting season that mysteriously lasted months. Construction equipment would break down in suspicious ways. Sugar in gas tanks, missing parts, cables that somehow got cut during the night. Well, accidents happen in the mountains. The really clever families figured out how to work the system. They'd file endless legal challenges, organize community meetings that lasted until midnight, and flood government offices with paperwork. Death by 1,000 cuts, mountain style. One family in Kentucky managed to delay a dam project for 7 years using nothing but bureaucratic warfare and stubborn determination. And the weird part is how these tactics spread. Families shared resistance strategies like recipe cards at church socials. What worked against coal companies in West Virginia got tried against logging operations in North Carolina. Pipeline protests in Pennsylvania borrowed techniques from strip mining fights in Tennessee. The government response was predictable. More surveillance, more federal agents, more families added to those watch lists we talked about earlier. Every act of resistance, violent or peaceful, got documented and filed away. But something unexpected was happening too. These mountain families were creating a legacy that would outlast any government report. The question becomes, what happens when decades of resistance finally end? When the smoke clears and the protests fade, what's left behind in these communities that fought so hard against outside control? The scars run deeper than most people realize. When the government bulldozed entire communities for national parks and dam projects, they didn't just destroy houses. They erased generations of family history, sacred burial grounds, and the intricate web of relationships that held mountain communities together. But here's what gets really twisted. Those threat labels stuck around like bad credit scores. Families who fought back against land seizures found themselves blacklisted from government jobs decades later. Coal miners whose grandfathers participated in Blair Mountain couldn't get work with federal contractors. The bureaucratic machinery has a long memory, and it holds grudges. Take the Martins of eastern Kentucky. After their great-grandfather led protests against strip mining in the 1940s, 3 generations dealt with mysterious job rejections and delayed permits. When young Johnny Martin applied for a Forest Service position in 1982, his application got lost multiple times. Coincidence? His family doesn't think so. Then there's the flip side that nobody talks about. Modern environmental activists discovered something powerful in those old stories of resistance. Tree sitters blocking pipeline construction aren't just hugging bark, they're channeling the same energy their ancestors used against railroad barons and coal companies. The tactics evolved, but the spirit remains unchanged. While mountain communities learned to celebrate what once brought shame, those violent feuds that made national headlines, local museums now display them with pride. The Hatfield-McCoy Trail brings tourists eager to hear stories about authentic mountain justice. What was once considered backward hillbilly violence became marketable heritage tourism. And the weird part is how selective this celebration gets. Communities embrace the romanticized version of their rebellious past while quietly forgetting the brutality. Gift shops sell t-shirts about mountain justice without mentioning the actual bodies that piled up during those feuds. Let's not forget how this history shapes current politics. When federal agents show up in Appalachian communities today, old-timers remember stories passed down about previous government intrusions. That suspicion isn't paranoia, it's inherited trauma wrapped in family folklore. Modern Appalachian identity became inseparable from this legacy of resistance. Politicians who want votes in coal country still reference those historic battles against outside interference. Makes sense, right? If your family stories include tales of government agents seizing land and breaking up communities, you're naturally skeptical of new federal programs. But why does this matter beyond mountain hollers? Because Appalachia became America's testing ground for how far the government could push rural communities. The techniques perfected in West Virginia coal camps got exported nationwide. Native American reservations, migrant worker communities, and urban neighborhoods all faced similar tactics of surveillance and control. The legal precedents set during Appalachian land seizures still influence eminent domain cases today. When developers want to grab property for shopping malls or sports stadiums, they use frameworks first tested on mountain families a century ago. This cycle continues because nobody learned the real lesson. Government power grows stronger when it faces organized resistance, not weaker. Those fierce mountain families who fought back actually helped create the surveillance state they feared most.